Hi everyone, my name is Ellie. I teach sewing and crafts at the library, and today I'm going to show you how to make this quilted leaf pot holder. If you've never done quilting before, I would check out my first pot holder video from a couple months ago. It's a little bit more traditional, a little more straightforward, but if you're up for the challenge, let's try this leaf. For this project, you will need cotton fabric, cotton batting, bias tape, coordinating thread, a walking foot attachment for your sewing machine, fabric scissors, sewing pins, some paper to make a pattern, and an iron and ironing board. First, you're going to want to draw your leaf shape on some paper so that you can make your pattern. So this is what I drew. I just freehanded it, and then I split it into two sections by drawing a line down the middle. So now we want to trace these onto our fabric. So I'm tracing on the back side of the fabric, so I'm also going to turn my pattern piece so that it's upside down as well. So make sure you do that for all your pieces, and that way they will line up like they should. And make sure that if you plan on using this pot holder to pick up hot pans or to put like a hot pot on top of, make sure that you use 100% cotton fabric. If you use any synthetic material, the heat may melt the fabric, so just keep that in mind as you are choosing which fabrics that you're using. Okay, so I'm going to cut this out. Okay, I already have my other piece cut out. So I'm going to put these together with the right sides facing, and then I'm going to sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I finished sewing my leaf together. I went ahead and pressed the seam flat, and there's some extra fabric sticking up here that I trimmed off. So now it's time to make the layers of our quilt. So I've got the fabric that I'm using for the back with the right side down. And then I have 2 layers of cotton batting. Again, make sure you're using cotton if you plan on using this for anything hot. The synthetic batting might melt, and we don't want that. Next, I have my leaf on top of that. And now I'm just going to take some fabric pins and pin this down. And so you want to make sure that the batting and the backing fabric are slightly bigger than your quilt top. That way we've got room for air if this happens to shift any, but also we're going to start and stop all of our quilting stitches on the outside of our quilt top. You could probably hear my cat a little bit earlier in the video. She just really needed to be here, so she's my little helper today. Okay, so you just need enough pins to keep your quilt in place. And so you can quilt this in any pattern that you would like. I think I'm going to start with 2 lines running pretty close to the center seam, and then I'm going to make kind of the veins of the leaf coming out from that. So I'm going to get out my sewing machine and we'll get started with the quilting. So I attached the walking foot or the quilting foot to my machine. Before we actually start quilting this, it's a good idea to just practice. So I took some similar cotton fabric and 2 layers of cotton batting, and then just kind of practiced quilting it. I wanted to make sure that I had the stitch length and tension set correctly, so I liked how this turned out. I just practiced doing my diagonal lines. So if you want, go ahead and kind of test your quilting, play around with the settings, and then once you have that figured out, we can start on our real quilt or potholder. Okay. So I've got my machine lined up so that I'm going to start quilting on the batting, not on my actual quilt top. And that'll just ensure that our stitches are secure. Okay, so I've sewn off of my quilt top just a couple stitches. Okay, so it's a little hard to see, but there's my first line of stitches. Now I'm just going to add the other stitch in the middle on the other side, and then I'll try and make some diagonal lines. So you can see I've got my first diagonal stitch down, so I'm just going to kind of show you how I did that. So I'm starting in the middle, and I want to make sure that my stitch starts on this middle vein stitch. So I've lined my foot up where I want it to start, and then I'm just going to turn the knob on the side of the machine down so I can see about where the needle is going to go into the fabric. So I can make sure that it's going to start exactly where I want it. Okay. Close enough. And then I'm just going to try and go at the same angle as this other stitch that I made previously. If you want, you can also draw lines onto your quilt to follow those, or you can just freehand it like me. So I'm going to continue this until I'm finished quilting. I just finished quilting my leaf, and I went ahead and trimmed up all the loose threads that were kind of in the middle. And now I'm going to cut out my leaf shape. This is probably the most exciting part of quilting to me, because you can finally see your project almost finished. And you can save these batting scraps to use as filling for pillows or stuffed animals, so those don't have to go to waste. Okay, I'm going to continue cutting this out, and then we're going to add the bias tape. Okay, so now I've got my leaf, my bias tape. In my last video, I showed you how to make bias tape, so if you want, check that out. If not, you can also get this at craft stores. So with my last quilting video, I showed you guys a different method of applying bias tape. We opened it up and just kind of wrapped it around the work like this and then sewed it down. But this bias tape is a lot thicker, and there are other ways to apply bias tape, so we're trying a new way today. So I'm going to take the edge that's open and line it up with the edge of my leaf. And I'm starting kind of at this flatter side. So I'm just going to pin that in place to start. Then I'm going to take this to my sewing machine, sew pretty close to the edge, maybe about 1/8 of an inch away, and just continue around this first side of the leaf, and then stop when you get to the point, back stitch, and then I'll show you how to turn the corner. So I'm almost finished attaching the bias tape to this side, so I'm just gonna keep sewing, and I want to make sure that I stop where this side ends at the point of the leaf. I think that's about right. So now I'm going to back stitch. And I'm using the same settings on my sewing machine as I did when I was quilting. Okay, now that that's nice and secure, I'm going to take out my pot holder. There goes my pins. Here we go. Okay. So now I'm going to fold the bias tape up towards the attached part of the bias tape so that the line of this side and the line of the bias tape edge meet up so it's straight. Okay. Now I'm going to take the free end of the bias tape and fold it back towards the work, making sure that I keep this part pressed down with my fingers. Okay, and now I'm going to pick back up sewing at this point, but now I'm sewing down this side with the red fabric. So I'm going to put a pin there just to hold it for now. Okay. I'm going to make sure that I'm sewing close to the edge again. And now I've got quite a bit of fabric to go through, so it's going to be a little hard to get through for these first couple stitches. Make sure stitch. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to keep attaching this bias tape like I did on the other side. I'm almost back to where I started. So I'm going to sew the bias tape so that it goes over this first layer just a little bit, and then I'm going to backstitch and stop. So this is what your leaf should look like once you take it out of your machine, but we're not quite done with the binding yet. So we're going to just roll the binding over to the back side like this, and then we're going to hand stitch it down. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over. I have a needle threaded with some brown thread so it'll match my bias tape, and I'm only using maybe about 16 inches of thread. I don't want to use too much so I don't get any tangles. So I'm holding the binding down onto the backing fabric. I'm going to poke my needle into just the backing fabric and then back up pretty close to where I put it in. Pull it all the way up, and I want to make sure that this little stitch is close to where the binding tape, the bias tape will fall, so that it'll cover up that knot in the tail. Okay. So then I'm going to take my needle. I'm going to poke it into the fold of the bias tape, pretty close to where my thread is now. And then I'm just going to push it through the bias tape right along the edge, and then come out a 1/4 inch or so away. Pull the thread. Okay, and now I'm going to put my needle down into the backing fabric, push it through, and come up about a 1/4 inch away. And I'm making sure that that's not going to be visible on the front side. I'm just going through the backing fabric and maybe a little bit of the batting. Okay, and then I'm going to go back up into the bias tape along the fold. Keep it close to the edge, poke it out. And then just continue just like that. Once you get the hang of this stitch, it's not too hard, and it should give you a pretty invisible binding. I can see a little stitch right there, but that's not too bad. Okay, so I'm going to continue just like that. So I've made it to the corner at the top. I've got a stitch pretty close to that point. So then I'm going to hold the side that I'm working on flat and then fold that extra fabric over towards my thumb, just like this, so that the fabric sits nice and flat at the point. Next, I'm going to poke my needle up into the bottom of the corner. And then I'm going to go through the edge of that bias tape. Okay. And then I'm going to go back down next to that folded edge. And I'm going into the backing here just a little bit and poking my needle up close to the bias tape. The good news is that this is the back, so if this doesn't turn out perfect for you, don't sweat it too much. Okay, so once I've turned the corner, I'm going to continue attaching the bias tape as I've done before. I'm almost done with this binding. When I got to the part where the 2 layers of binding tape overlap, I just kind of went through both of those layers when I made my stitch there. So I've got just a couple stitches left. Okay. So I've got the binding tape finished. Now I just need to tie off this thread. So I'm right next to this stitch that I made to start. So I'm just gonna go pass my needle underneath that. And then back through the loop that I made to tie a knot. Through that stitch again. And then pass your needle through the loop to tie another knot. And I'm just gonna cut this off. Okay, so we finally have this leaf pot holder done. That was definitely a challenge. This was quite the journey, but I'm glad that I finished it. If you didn't like this method of applying bias tape, check out my last quilting video for that tutorial, but I would use a thinner bias tape. Like this is like a 1/2 inch. I think that's gonna be about the same look. Anything bigger than that I think is gonna be too wide and it'll look too clunky. Anyway, thank you guys for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you all next time. Bye!